Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about an expression that you see all the time in anime, manga, light novels, etc. and can be confusing for two reasons. One is that the apparent etymology, the apparent base of the word is very obvious, but it's completely misleading. And the other is that because of the way it's used, it's often a bit unclear about which way it's pointing and what it's actually doing. However, once we get clear about this, it's very, very easy to understand. The expression is Kuse ni. Now, the etymological problem, as it were, is that we all know what Kuse means. It means a habit or idiosyncrasy. But it's not very clear what that has to do with the expression Kuse ni. And the answer is nothing. Some Japanese etymological sources tell us that this Kuse was actually a different Kuse originally, but nobody really seems to know for sure. But the point is that it really has very little to do with the modern usage. All we really need to know is that Kuse ni is a contrastive conjunction like no ni. Now, I've done a video about no ni, and I'll put a link here, but I'm going to assume that you basically know what it is and what it does. No ni and Kuse ni are contrastive conjunctions, which mean that they're like demo or keredo. They join two clauses in a manner that means despite clause A, clause B, even though clause A, clause B. Now, Kuse ni has two things in common with no ni. One is that it's generally negative in its implications, and the other is that the second clause quite often gets omitted. So we're saying although clause A, and then not going on to say what clause B is, we're just implying it. No ni does that quite often, and so does Kuse ni. The difference between no ni and Kuse ni is that Kuse ni not only has a negative implication, but it has most of the time a very specific kind of negative implication. And this special usage is essentially taking the nature or character or position of a person and then contrasting their actions with it in a way that is highly unfavorable. So we could use no ni in these situations, but no ni would sound more regretful. Kuse ni sounds much more forceful. It often sounds like severe criticism. And as we say, it's making this kind of contrast, a contrast between what we expect of a certain type and what they actually do. And it's a negative contrast. So, for example, we might say, Okanemochi no Kuse ni kechi da. Despite the fact that she's well off, she's rich, she's stingy. Onna no Kuse ni heya ga mechakucha da. Despite the fact that she's a girl, her room's a mess. Otoko no Kuse ni naiteru. Despite the fact that he's a man, he's crying. And these are generally intended in an offensive manner. They're intended to register harsh criticism. So we're taking the position of the person and what we expect of that kind of person and then saying something that's in contrast to it. But very often we also leave that out. So, for example, suppose some bad people or monsters break into the house and the heroine confronts them and the hero is cowering in a corner. The heroine might just say, Otoko no Kuse ni, which literally means despite the fact that you're a man, but doesn't then say anything about it. In English, probably a non-structural but natural translation would be, and you're supposed to be a man. And this can cause confusion because it can lead to constructions that confuse us about what's really going on and which way Kuse ni is pointing. So, for example, Otoko no Kuse ni nakanai de yo. Now, what's going on here? Despite the fact that you're a man, stop crying. Is that what it's saying? Well, no, it isn't. Otoko no Kuse ni is being used in a trailing manner, like the previous example. And then, nakanai de yo is being added to that trailing insult, as it were. And that's a command. I've done a video commands. So nakanaideyo is not a sentence, it's just a command. Stop crying. Just as in English, stop crying is not a sentence with a subject and a predicate, it's just a command. So really those two statements should be separated by a period, or in Japanese a maro, because they're not part of the same sentence, but they won't necessarily be when you see them written, and they won't necessarily have a wide gap when you hear them spoken. Otoko no kuse ni nakanai yo. But these are two separate statements, and if we don't understand that, it can confuse us about the use of kuse ni. Another thing that can be confusing is that the connection may go the other way around. Generally speaking, we take the qualities of a person, which are fundamentally good qualities, being a man, being a girl, being rich, and then adding something negative to it, despite the fact that you're a girl. The room's a mess. Despite the fact that you're a man, you're hiding in the corner. Despite the fact that you're rich, you're stingy. But it can go the other way around too. For example, we might say, Heta na kuse ni ne shinda. This means, despite the fact that he's unskillful, useless, he's enthusiastic. Now, this generally isn't used in a positive sense. It's meaning, here's this person going around being all enthusiastic, and he's useless, he can't do anything. So it can also work that way around, and we need to be aware of that, because that again can fool us. Most of the time the contrastive conjunction goes the way around we've been talking about, but it doesn't have to. Now, if this was a textbook or a JLPT instruction, we would talk about what they call the setsuzoku, the conjunctions. How does kuseni attach to what comes before it? We know how it attaches to what comes after it. It's simply a clause connector, so what comes after it is a second clause, which could be left off. But what the standard texts will talk about is how it connects to what comes before it. With a noun you use no, with an adjectival noun you use na, with an adjective you don't use anything. None of this, of course, is necessary if you've done structural Japanese. Kuse, whatever it is, whatever its etymology, is a noun. We pretty much know that because anything that isn't a verb or an adjective is a noun in Japanese. What comes before kuse is modifying kuse. It's telling us what kind of kuse we're talking about, and it does that in exactly the same way that every modifier always modifies a noun. So if it's a noun, which it most often is, then we use no for modifying the other noun that's following it, just as we always do. Otoko no kuse, onna no kuse ni. If it happens to be an adjectival noun, then obviously we use na, as we did with heta na kuse ni. And if it's an adjective, obviously you don't need anything else. Adjectives modify nouns directly. That's what an adjective does. So we might say, wakai kuse ni otoshi yori ni seki o yuzuranai. Even though she's young, she doesn't give up her seat to older people. If it were a verb, obviously we just use the verb to modify the noun as we always do. So I think now you won't have any problems with kuse ni. If you have any problems or questions about that or anything else, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters. One of the things that our revolution in Japanese is doing is not just showing us techniques to apply, but showing us that we need to apply them flexibly. Some techniques apply sometimes and not other times. History and etymology of words can be very useful on occasion, and I've done videos about that, and whenever I do a video about that, even if I point out that history and etymology are not always very useful, people start asking me, do you know the history of this? Do you know the history of that? And, well, of course I can just look it up in most cases. You can't always find it in English, but you can usually find it in Japanese. But the point is that there are occasions where the etymology helps us enormously. There are occasions where it doesn't help us at all. There are occasions where it could help us somewhat, but it's a rather roundabout route, and we can shortcut it by learning things by another method. Part of our revolution here is getting away from the rigid approach of textbooks, but always applying the fundamental structural knowledge, because structural knowledge gives us the core we need to get us away from rote learning of this and rote learning of that. Thank you all for your help in this revolution. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.